The first time I heard the pines breathe, I thought it was just the wind. I told myself that over and over again, whispering it like a reassurance I no longer believed, because sometimes it's easier to cling to logic than admit the forest is watching you. And if these woods have taught me anything, it's that they don't care about your logic. They only care about what you bring into them, your fears, your doubts, your memories, and they know how to use every one of them against you. My name isn't important, not anymore, not to this story, and not to what followed. I'm in my early 40s, old enough to know better than to wander these trails alone at night, but still stubborn enough to do it anyway. I've spent most of my adult life working as a forest ranger in the heart of the Northern Rockies, a place where the tree line rises like old cathedral walls, and the valleys seem to fold into each other like bruised green scars. Locals simply call it the Pines. They don't bother with the full name anymore. To them, the forest is a living thing, ancient and temperamental. You call it by its proper name only if you want it to answer. My station is small, a 2-room cabin tucked deep along a service road that's usually drowned in mud by early autumn. The nearest town sits 12 miles away, half of it abandoned, the other half clinging to the sort of quiet defiance you only see in places the world forgot. People there don't talk much, but every once in a while, usually after they've had something strong poured into a chipped glass, they'll let slip a story. Strange lights drifting through the timberline, disappearances never solved, voices that call out in the dark using the names of people long dead. They don't tell these stories to entertain, they tell them to warn. I used to brush all that off as folklore, the kind that sticks to rural places like smoke clings to clothes. But then again, a lot of people who brush things off out here didn't stay long. Most lasted a season. Few made it a year. Somehow, I made it almost 20. Every ranger learns a few hard lessons early on. Mine came my first month. Never ignore your instincts. Never stay in the woods after dusk without a radio and a way out. And never, under any circumstances, approach a cave unless you absolutely have to. The locals don't even call them caves. They say openings, as if the land itself occasionally parts to reveal something beneath it, a world not meant for people like us. For the longest time, I thought those warnings were exaggerated. I used to smile politely when old-timers leaned in and lowered their voices just to say, "You mind the caves, Ranger." I believed in storms, in predators, in flash floods and wildfires, not spirits, not curses, not breathing trees or things that walked upright with the silence of falling snow. That was before the winter I spent completely alone at the station. The winter the snowpack was so deep it sealed the road until late spring. Before the footsteps that circled my cabin at night. Before the cave. That winter was the beginning of the end for my confidence, my rationality, and the part of me that still believed I understood these woods. I remember the first strange event with perfect clarity. It was early November, the air sharp enough to make every breath feel like I was inhaling glass dust. I was finishing patrol when I heard a crack. A deliberate crack, like a heavy branch being snapped in two. My first thought was poachers, or a cougar, or maybe a black bear disturbed from a late denning. But what chilled me wasn't the sound itself. It was the silence afterward. Animals don't leave silence behind. They shuffle. They breathe. They move. This didn't. The trail was lined with frozen pines leaning in on both sides. I scanned the tree line, hand on my radio, trying to identify the source. Nothing moved, not a shadow, not a patch of snow, not the slightest hint of wind. Then the smell hit, like a cave's breath, damp and mineral, drifting through a forest that should have smelled of frost and pine sap. It belonged to a place far underground, a place no surface animal walked. As the scent grew thicker, I felt my pulse climb into my throat. I called out, half expecting my voice to crack in the cold. "Hello? Anyone there?" My echo came back wrong, too slow, as if the trees swallowed the sound and released it at their own pace. I felt the first thread of unease spool tight inside my chest. I should have gone back to the cabin. Any sensible ranger would have. But I'd built my reputation on never backing down from something unknown in my own district. Pride mixed with duty is a dangerous thing. So I stepped off the trail. Snow crunched beneath me, faint and brittle. The deeper I moved between the pines, the darker everything became, even though it was only late afternoon. The sun, which had been hanging in a clear sky moments earlier, now felt distant, muted by the dense canopy. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging, trunks like pillars, branches weaving into something almost like ribs overhead. And then I saw it, a footprint pressed into the snow. Deep, wide, bare. My breath left me in a cloud. Nothing human leaves a print like that. Not that size, not that depth, not with those proportions. The toes were long, spreading slightly. The heels sunk inches deeper than mine ever could. I crouched, studying it, telling myself it was distorted by melt or by some trick of light. But the cold air held it crisp and clear. Another print lay a few feet ahead, then another. Each angled slightly toward the same direction, toward a small rise in the terrain where a dark seam cut through the snow-dusted hill, a narrow gap between boulders, an opening. My chest tightened. Caves. I wasn't supposed to go near them. I straightened slowly, every instinct tugging me backward toward the trail. That's when the forest exhaled, long, low, and deep enough to vibrate through the ground. A wave of cold air pushed past me, carrying that same underground scent. The pines around me shook, though no wind moved. And beneath it, God help me, I heard a voice. It didn't speak a word. It didn't need to. It was a sound somewhere between a groan and a hum, a resonant vibration that made the hair on my arms stand straight. It came from the opening, from inside. I froze, one hand instinctively brushing the radio clip to my jacket, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't move at all. I stared at the gap in the rocks, waiting for something, anything to emerge. The air thickened. A strange heaviness pressed against my skin, prickling like static. Then, a shadow shifted behind the opening. Slow, deliberate, massive. I took a single step back, then another, trying not to break whatever fragile boundary existed between me and whatever lay inside that cave. The forest felt charged, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The shadow leaned forward, and then the unmistakable sound reached me, a long, low exhale, almost human. That was enough. Instinct snapped my paralysis. I turned and bolted back toward the trail, forcing my legs to move through the deepening snow. Branches whipped against my jacket. My breath tore from me in ragged gasps. Behind me, something shifted through the pines, heavy, measured, following. I didn't dare look back. When I broke onto the trail, the last light of day finally hit my face like a slap. My pulse pounded in my ears as I sprinted toward the cabin. Only when I slammed the door behind me, every lock snapping into place, did I finally let myself breathe. It wasn't until later, when my heart had stopped racing and the snow outside began to fall in slow, steady flakes, that the fear shifted into something else. Denial. I told myself it was a bear, a large one. Tracks can warp in snow. Sound can distort in the cold. Shadows can lie. I clung to rationality like a drowning man clings to driftwood. But that night, long past midnight, when I awoke to the soft crunch of footsteps circling my cabin, denial didn't feel like enough anymore. I didn't move at first. I lay there listening, every muscle locked tight beneath my blankets, my breathing shallow enough to hurt. The cabin walls were thin, the kind of thin that makes you hyper-aware of every sound outside, the kind of thin that reminds you the forest has always been bigger, older, and stronger than you are. I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, crunching just inches beyond the outer wall. I waited for the familiar rhythm of a deer testing the edge of the clearing or the sharp, confident sound of a bear pacing. But this was neither. The steps were too measured, too heavy, too aware of me. I could almost picture the weight of each one pressing deep into the snow, leaving prints just like the ones I'd seen earlier that day. A cold prickling slid along my spine. The footsteps stopped, at my door. The cabin fell silent, no wind, no settling snow, nothing. Just a thick, unnatural stillness that pressed against the windows like an unseen hand. I strained to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. Then a sound slid through the gap beneath the door, soft, low, and impossibly controlled. Breathing. Not huffing, not snorting, not the chuffing sound of a bear. Something breathing like it was listening for me. That was when I made the mistake of shifting slightly in bed. The sheets rustled, the faintest whisper of movement, yet the breathing outside changed instantly. It deepened, leaned in, as if the thing on the other side of the door had pressed its face right up against it. I froze again, my throat tightening, my mind screaming to stay still. The door handle rattled softly, as though someone was testing it with a slow, cautious turn. The locks held, But it tried again, a click, another, then a long drag of something. Fingers, claws, moving down the wooden panels. My breath shook. I don't know how long I lay there like that, staring at the ceiling, counting each slow second. Eventually, the handle stopped moving. The breathing faded. And finally, after what felt like an hour, I heard the footsteps retreat into the forest, one slow step at a time. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, when the sun finally broke through the pines, I forced myself to open the door. My boots sank deep into fresh powder. I scanned the clearing, then looked down. Tracks circled the entire cabin, large, barefoot prints, the same shape, the same depth, the same alien stride. But what unsettled me most wasn't that something had walked around my cabin all night. It was the fact that the prints stopped abruptly, 10 feet away, vanishing into undisturbed snow, not leading away, not doubling back, just stopping, as if whatever made them simply dissolved into the air. I radioed it in out of protocol, knowing no one was close enough to respond and even fewer would believe me. But the report made me feel less alone, if only for a moment. I tried to rationalize again. My mind searched for shapes that made sense. Escaped camper without boots, distorted melting, some bizarre series of coincidences. But nothing human walked barefoot in negative temperatures, and nothing human breathed like that at my door. Still, I went about my duties that day, pretending life hadn't tilted into something strange and fragile. That night, I barricaded the door with my table, my chair, even the heavy equipment case I normally kept by the wall. Objectively, I knew it wouldn't do much if something huge wanted in, but it helped. For a while. The second strange event happened a few days later, during a late patrol near a ridge the locals call Whisperback. It's a long, narrow slope lined with thick pine stands that funnel the wind into strange harmonics. Sometimes it moans. Sometimes it almost sings. People avoid that area for reasons they can't articulate. They say the sound gets inside your head. I didn't believe them, not until that day. Snow had fallen steadily since morning, coating the ridge in a thick blanket that swallowed sound. As I hiked, everything felt muffled, too soft, as if the world around me had been wrapped in cotton. The forest was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl, not peaceful, but waiting. Then, halfway up the ridge, I smelled it again. That same cave breath scent. It drifted through the trees, faint but unmistakable, carried on a breeze that didn't match the stillness around me. The cold deepened instantly. My fingertips went numb inside my gloves. I looked around. Nothing moved. Then the whispering began. At first, it was subtle, like wind slipping through hollow spaces. But there was no wind, not enough to make a sound like that. The whispering grew clearer. Not words exactly, but something shaped like speech, a rhythm, a cadence, a murmur that seemed to echo from tree to tree as if carried on invisible threads. I turned slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Every instinct begged me to run, but rangers don't run from the forest. You run from a predator, a rock slide, a fire, not from trees whispering things you don't understand. Still, the whispering grew louder. Then I heard it. A knock. A single, unmistakable knock echoing through the woods. Not a branch falling, not ice cracking. A knock on wood. I spun in place, scanning every trunk, every hollow, every dark gap between the trees. My breath fogged the air in short, frantic bursts. The knocking came again, 2 taps this time, sharp and perfectly spaced. Knocking is a communication behavior. I'd heard it from woodpeckers, from lost hikers signaling for help, from rangers calling out to each other during search operations. But this was none of those. This knock had weight, intent. It was loud enough to carry across the ridge, bouncing through the pines in a way that shook something deep in me. I raised my voice. "Who's there?" The forest went dead silent, the kind of silence that swallows your voice whole. Then the knock came again, closer, much closer. I felt a tremor run through me, rooting me to the spot. My eyes searched the tree line frantically, and that's when I saw it. A silhouette, tall, broad, motionless, half hidden between 2 massive pines, its shape barely visible through falling snow. It stood unnaturally still, as though the forest itself carved it from shadow. I couldn't make out details, no face, no features, just the unmistakable outline of something towering and upright. My throat tightened. I stepped backward, very slowly, trying not to provoke whatever was watching me. My boots sank deep into the snow, each movement heavy and deliberate. The silhouette didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even sway. But then, the whispering started again. Not around me this time. From the silhouette itself, a deep rolling murmur, like distant thunder trapped in a throat. My blood went cold. I took another step back, then another. The silhouette shifted, just a fraction, but enough to destroy any illusion that it was a tree. I turned and began descending the ridge, fast but not running, not yet. My training screamed at me to stay controlled, but when the knock echoed again, directly behind me this time, my control shattered. I ran. I tore down that slope with reckless speed, snow exploding beneath my boots, branches clawing at my jacket. The forest blurred past me. My breath burned in my chest, and behind me I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, steady, following. I didn't look back. I just ran until the trees thinned and I broke onto the service road, lungs searing. Only when I reached the open stretch did I risk turning around. Nothing was there. But the knocking, distant now, echoed once more from the ridge. 3 slow taps, as if it knew I had heard it. That was the moment I accepted something I'd spent my entire career refusing to believe. There was something in these woods that didn't belong to any ecosystem, any biology, any world I understood. Something that watched, listened, waited, and it wasn't done with me. For the next several days, I tried to pretend nothing had changed, that I wasn't seeing silhouettes in the snow, that I wasn't hearing knocking where no human should be, that I wasn't waking each morning to find new footprints pressed deep around my cabin, always in a different pattern, always circling, never leading away. I documented them, of course, measured them, photographed them. Any ranger would. I told myself I was acting out of duty, not fear. But fear was becoming a quiet companion, settling deeper with every passing night. It lived in my ribs, in the back of my throat, in the moments I stood at the window, staring into the tree line, convinced something was staring back. The forest had changed. Or maybe I had. The soundscape was different. The echoes stretched too long. The wind hesitated before moving the branches. Even the animals seemed to avoid my clearing. The deer trails that usually skirted my cabin had grown cold. No tracks, no scat, no sign of life. Nature doesn't abandon a place without reason. By the 4th night, when the footsteps returned, heavier, slower, more deliberate, I stopped pretending it was anything but a pattern. The unease had grown into tension, tightening around my chest with each creak of the floorboards. The footsteps moved with intention, circling once, twice, then stopping again at the door. This time, the breathing wasn't quiet. It rumbled through the seams of the wood, deep and resonant, vibrating the cabin floor. I sat frozen in my chair, hands gripping the armrests, every instinct demanding I get up. Do something. Make a noise. Speak. But no sound came from my mouth. It was as if the forest had stolen my voice. The breathing intensified, a slow inhale, a longer exhale, as though the thing on the other side was smelling the air leaking from the cabin. The idea rooted itself so deeply in me that I felt sick. It knew me, my scent, my routine, my weaknesses. Then came the tapping, just 3 soft taps along the window pane. Not knocking this time, fingertips. I forced myself not to look. Staring at it would be an invitation. I could practically feel the weight of eyes waiting for my gaze. When the tapping finally stopped and the footsteps receded, I exhaled so sharply my lungs burned. I didn't realize until then that tears had gathered at the edges of my eyes. The forest was no longer just watching. It was pressing in on me. And I knew it was only a matter of time before something escalated. The escalation came the next morning. A call crackled through the radio around 8 a.m., a rare break in the winter monotony. A hiker had gone missing. 2 locals from the nearby town, a father and son tracking elk, reported strange noises near a ravine and footprints belonging to someone who wasn't part of their group. Then the father vanished. Search and rescue was 30 miles out and snowbound. I was the closest by far. Part of me wanted to refuse the call. Every instinct told me the forest was drawing me deeper on purpose. But a ranger doesn't get the luxury of walking away. I layered up, grabbed my pack, and headed out. The hike toward the ravine was grueling. Snow had piled knee-high in places, and temperatures had plunged overnight. Each breath crystallized in front of me. The pines stood unnaturally still despite the worsening weather, heavy branches sagging under fresh accumulation, creating a tunnel of white silence. An hour in, I reached the trail the locals had described, a narrow route threading through dense stands of timber. I noticed the first set of tracks almost immediately, human prints, deep and staggered like someone had been running. But there was another set next to them, the large ones, the ones I'd seen around my cabin. I stopped dead, heart hammering. Seeing them here, miles from the station, somehow made everything feel more intentional, more targeted. The footprints trailed uphill toward the ravine, the same direction the father had run. Against all logic, all rationality, I followed. I wish I could say I was brave then. But the truth is, I was terrified, terrified of what I would find, and even more terrified that I already knew. Halfway up the slope, the forest changed again. The air grew colder, biting deep through my layers. The smell returned, that subterranean mineral stench, heavy and damp, like the mouth of the cave had opened somewhere nearby. Every hair on my body stood on end. The tracks led to the edge of the ravine. And then they stopped, not turned, not doubled back, stopped. The snow was pristine beyond that point, untouched, unbroken, stretching out infinitely into the white expanse. My breath caught. I crouched, studying the last print. The human one was dragged slightly, as if the man had been pulled. The larger print beside it was sunk so deep it must have weighed twice what I did. But there were no signs of a fall, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no broken branches, just a sudden, perfect absence. I straightened slowly, forcing down panic as I swept the ravine with my eyes. It was a steep drop, but not lethal, not without evidence. Something else had happened here, something the forest didn't want me to understand. A low hum vibrated through the air, was so faint I thought at first it was my heartbeat. But no, it resonated from the trees, from the snow, from everywhere at once. The same sound I'd heard near the cave. A subterranean voice rising through the earth. The pines were speaking, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what they were saying. As I backed away from the ravine, a shadow shifted at the corner of my vision. I spun toward it. Another silhouette, tall, motionless, stood between two massive pines far down the slope, the same proportion as the one on Whisperback, the same unnatural stillness. This time, it didn't hide. It stepped forward. The movement was slow but deliberate, the way a predator moves when it doesn't need to rush. Snow crunched beneath its feet in deep, rhythmic thuds. I stumbled backward, pulse roaring in my ears. My radio crackled faintly, but no voice came through, only static. The silhouette paused at the edge of the clearing. I could feel its focus like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My legs trembled, my throat went dry, and then it made a sound. A low, guttural call that vibrated through the trees, through the snow, through my bones. It sounded almost human. Almost. But stretched, warped, as if mimicking a language it didn't understand. I realized then that the father had never run from an elk. He had run from this. I forced myself to turn away. Not run, just move. Slowly, deliberately. Breaking eye contact felt like stepping into a void. The moment I did, the forest erupted with noise. A sudden, thunderous crack, echoing somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. If I did, I wouldn't make it home. I descended the slope with shaking legs, slipping more than once, grabbing branches to keep from falling. Snow blasted into my face, the whispering rose on the wind, and somewhere in the storm of sound, buried beneath it all, I heard a faint, desperate cry. A human one. The father's. I wanted to turn. Every cell in me screamed to turn, but instincts, true instincts, kept me moving. Survive now. Understand later. Live long enough to warn the next ranger, foolish enough to think the pines held only trees and shadows. The cry grew louder behind me, full of agony and terror. I kept walking. I had to. If I ran toward that voice, the pines would take me too. By the time I reached the lower trail, the cry had faded entirely. The silence that followed felt absolute, like an ending. I radioed the report with shaking hands, saying only that conditions were too unstable to proceed. They told me to return to the station, that a team would come when the storm cleared. But I already knew. No one would find a body. No one ever did. And deep inside me, beneath the fear and denial and shaking exhaustion, a darker truth was forming, one I didn't want to admit. Whatever moved through these woods wasn't wandering, it was hunting, and I was next. When I reached the station, the storm was already closing in. Snow hammered the roof in uneven pulses, like fists beating from above. The wind moaned low through the chimney, deepening into a tone that vibrated the window panes. I set the radio on the table, but the static drowned out every channel. I tried again and again. Nothing. The forest had taken my signal. I locked the door, then locked it again, though the barriers felt useless. Meaningless gestures against something that didn't care about human carpentry. The memory of the father's distant scream tangled itself inside me, coiling tight until my breath came shallow. That sound would never leave me. It carried accusation, fear, and a final question I didn't want to interpret. Why didn't you help me? Because I couldn't. Because I wouldn't survive it. Because something ancient had reached up from beneath the pines and taken him in a way I still didn't understand. Because the forest doesn't negotiate, it consumes. I paced the small cabin, every step stirring dust from corners untouched for too long. The lantern light flickered, casting shadows that swayed like figures ready to detach themselves from the walls. The air felt thick, as if everything inside was waiting, like the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Something had shifted the moment I left that ravine. Not in the forest, in me. For the first time since I became a ranger, I wanted to leave these woods behind. Not for a weekend, not for a season, for good. That instinct, raw and unfamiliar, was more frightening than anything I had seen. My identity had been carved by these trails, these trees, these storms, but that identity had a crack now, a widening one. The storm intensified, and with it, the knocking returned. A single knock on the wall behind the cabin. Not the door, the back wall, the one facing the densest stretch of pines. I froze in place, lantern in hand. Knock. Another, louder, a deliberate echo beneath the howl of the wind. Then silence. I moved to the front window and pulled the curtain just an inch, just enough to see the clearing. Snow swirled madly in the wind, forming spirals that dissolved into the dark. Nothing stood outside. No tracks. No movement. But the knocking hadn't been imagined. Its vibrations still tingled through my fingertips. I lowered the curtain, heart slamming, and stepped backward, straight into another sound. A muffled thud against the side of the cabin, then another, and another. 3 impacts in different places, as if something circled me. I backed toward the table, each step trembling through the floorboards. Then the breathing began again, not outside, underneath. Slow, heavy inhalations rising through the floor like the cabin stood atop a lung. I staggered away from the boards beneath my feet, staring down, imagining a massive chest expanding in the cold earth below. Then everything went silent. For one suspended moment, the storm outside paused. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A voice, low, resonant, and impossibly deep, spoke through the floorboards, not in words, not in any language I knew, but in a sound so old and broken it felt like a warning, a summons, and a hunger rolled together. The kind of sound that existed before language. My stomach twisted. My knees buckled. The voice rose, vibrating through the cabin, shaking dust from the rafters. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound burrowed inward, echoing inside my skull. My vision blurred at the edges. Then the floor groaned. The boards bowed upward in the center of the room, as if something enormous pressed against them from below. I ran. I didn't plan my route. I didn't think. I grabbed my coat, threw open the door, and plunged into the blizzard without looking back. The air hit me like freezing knives. Snow blinded me instantly. The wind roared like a living thing. Behind me, the cabin door slammed shut on its own. I stumbled into the clearing, disoriented by the whiteout, every direction identical. I turned left toward where I thought the road was, but the storm erased the world faster than I could orient myself. My flashlight cut through the swirling snow only a foot or two ahead. That's when I heard the footsteps. Behind me, not hurried, not frantic, slow, measured, the same cadence that had circled my cabin night after night. I spun, shining the light through the storm, but it reflected off nothing, just snow and wind and darkness. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. Then they stopped. The forest exhaled around me, a massive breath rolling through the storm as though the trees themselves leaned forward. I turned in a circle, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and the beam landed on a pair of eyes. Reflective, amber, motionless. Set impossibly high above the ground, my pulse detonated. The eyes blinked once, slow, deliberate. Snow parted around the shape standing behind them, revealing the outline I had only glimpsed before. Broad shoulders, long arms. The silhouette of something towering and thick with muscle, its fur coated in frost and snow. A shape that had watched me from ridges, had circled my cabin, had followed human footprints into nothing. A shape the locals whispered about but never described. It took one silent step toward me. I stepped back, my boots sinking into deep snow. The flashlight dimmed as the cold drained its battery. My breath puffed in frantic bursts, and frost gathered in my lashes. The storm howled around us, but the pines fell quiet, listening. The creature, if creature was the right word, tilted its head slightly, the way an animal studies something it doesn't recognize, or something it recognizes too well. In its gaze, I felt a terrifying intelligence. Not human, not animal, something older, something shaped by cave darkness and winter black ages, something that understood fear the way predators understand blood. My voice finally broke through the paralysis. What do you want? It didn't move. It just breathed, slow, enormous breaths that shifted the snow around its chest. Each exhale rolled over me like a wave of heat and cold mixed together. Then it did something I never expected. It stepped aside. Just one large step, opening a small path through the snow. I stared, disoriented. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't charging. It wasn't reaching for me. It had simply cleared a way. Not for escape. For direction. I looked past it through the storm where the pines stood darker than the night itself. Dense, ancient, swallowing the whiteout. The path the creature offered led deeper. Not toward the service road. Not toward safety. Toward the caves. I shook my head slowly. No. My voice cracked. No, I'm not going there. The storm muffled my words, but the creature understood. Or maybe it didn't need my voice at all, because it stepped back into the center of the clearing and blocked every other direction. My breath hitched. The pines creaked under the weight of the wind. The storm screamed. The truth landed with crushing clarity. It wasn't guiding me. It was hurting me. Just like the father. Just like the others who had vanished. I stood in that storm. The flashlight fading, my body shaking from cold and terror. My mind clawed for options, but one truth cut through all the panic. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't overpower it. I couldn't hide from it, but I could deny it. So I took a breath that burned like fire in my lungs and stepped backward toward the open road instead of the pines. The creature's chest expanded, its breath deepening into a low growl. Snow trembled around its feet. The storm seemed to stall, as if waiting for the moment of impact. I whispered into the wind, no. Then I ran. Blindly, desperately. Through the blizzard, through the dark, through the claustrophobic tunnel of noise and cold that threatened to swallow me whole. The pines roared behind me. The footsteps thundered. The forest screamed. But something inside me, some ragged instinct of survival, kept my legs moving. I don't remember how long I ran. Time dissolved into snow and fear. Eventually, the storm thinned. The wind softened, and the trees opened enough for me to see the dim outline of the service road. I collapsed there on my hands and knees, gasping, trembling, barely conscious. The storm faded behind me, retreating into the pines like a curtain falling over a stage. The creature didn't follow, not past the tree line, not onto the road. It just watched. I could feel its stare long after I could no longer see it. I made it to town at dawn, frostbitten and delirious. They found me collapsed outside the diner, whispering about caves and eyes and breathing earth. Weeks passed before I could walk steadily again. Months before my hands stopped shaking. I never went back to the station. Some say I abandoned my post, some say I lost my mind, some say the forest finally marked me. But every night when the wind shifts just right, I hear the whispering again. The same cadence, the same ancient murmur threading through the pines no matter where I am. A reminder, a warning. And sometimes, when the world goes quiet enough, I swear I hear something else. Breathing, waiting, hoping I forget the truth I carry. The pines don't want visitors, they want witnesses, and the spirits inside them never let the witnesses go. I've learned a strange truth living out here in the deep pines. Sometimes the forest breathes back. And when it does, it doesn't sigh with the wind or shift with the wildlife. It exhales with intention, like something ancient is waiting for you to listen. My name isn't important, at least not out here. I've worked these woods since I was 22, long before my hair started turning gray at the edges and my hands began to shake on cold mornings. I'm somewhere in my 40s now, stationed in a remote district of the Cascade Range, a place where mountains grow like teeth from the earth, and the pines seem to lean in when you're walking alone. Out here, reputation doesn't matter. Awards don't matter. What matters is whether the forest accepts you or tolerates you long enough to let you walk back out. The locals call this region the Whisper Belt. A stretch of ridges and old logging roads where people vanish without leaving so much as a boot print. It's not on any map. It's the kind of name only spoken in passing at the bar on the edge of town, with voices low and eyes fixed on the doorway as if someone might be listening from just outside. When I first arrived, some of the older rangers tested me with the usual warnings. Don't walk past mile marker 19 after dusk. Don't whistle under the hemlocks near the old mining trail. Don't follow lights unless you know who's carrying them. I brushed it all off. I had training, experience, logic. I thought fear was something you could muscle through with enough confidence and proper search and rescue protocol. But fear out here, it doesn't confront you head on. It curls around you slowly, like fog around an ankle. My introduction to that fear happened my first autumn in the district. The nights were colder than I expected, and the air carried this eerie clarity to it, like sound traveled farther than it should. You could hear everything. Branches snapping half a mile away, coyotes yipping even from the lower valleys, wind scratching through pine needles like fingertips. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest feel hollow. On one of those nights, I took the truck out to patrol a remote loop. Logging roads were starting to freeze over, and I needed to check that no campers were trapped at the far end of the ridge. The sky was cloudless, the moon bright enough to cast clear shadows across the dirt. As I drove slowly through the thick corridor of trees, I felt that familiar sense of solitude settle in. But that night, the solitude felt different, like someone else was claiming the silence before I could. I reached a narrow turnout facing a steep drop into the valley. From there, you can usually see the distant porch lights from the outskirts of town. But the valley was dark, completely dark. Not a single house light, not a single vehicle on the service road. It was as if the world below had blinked out for the night. I stepped out of the truck and radioed base. No response. I wasn't worried. Patchy service was normal. But the quiet made me shift my weight between my boots, listening. When the wind finally rose, it carried something familiar, yet faint. A sound I'd heard only once before, when I was a boy camping in Montana with my uncle. A call. Long, low, not quite animal, not quite human. I felt it in my ribs more than my ears. A vibration, a resonance that made the air around me thicken. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a cougar, maybe an elk with a damaged throat, but the sound wasn't wild. It was deliberate, echoed with cadence, like syllables stretched into a moan. The locals sometimes spoke of a creature in these woods, never directly, always as if slipping the idea onto the table without taking ownership of it. They never said Yeti, but they'd arch a brow when someone joked about it. They'd warn us to avoid certain drainages during heavy snowfall. They'd tell us to listen for the knock before dark. I always assumed it was part tradition, part small town's superstition. But that night, I wasn't so sure. The call came again, this time closer. The air tightened around the sound, compressing the breath in my lungs. I reached instinctively for the spotlight on the truck. The forest swallowed the beam as soon as it passed the first few rows of trees, like the darkness was thicker there. That's when I noticed something else. A scent. Not rot, not dead animal. Something colder. Metallic, like iron scraped against stone, carrying the bite of winter with it. I'd smelled that once during a body recovery in the Rockies, where cold seeped out of the ravine like it had a pulse. My instincts told me to get back in the truck. My training told me to observe. My pride told me I wasn't scared. All three of them were wrong in their own way. A branch snapped to my right, not the crack of deadfall, but the clean, sharp snap of something stepping where it shouldn't. I swung the light toward the sound, but the beam cut empty air. Except, no. Not empty. There was movement, a shifting silhouette behind the second row of trees. Tall, too tall, but not rushing, not hiding, almost as if it knew the exact distance where my spotlight would fail. The fear that hit me then wasn't the kind that makes you jump or scream. It was quiet, heavy. It rose from the pit of my stomach like something long asleep finally noticing me. My radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static so violent I flinched. A voice tried to form through the interference, but I couldn't make out the words. Only one thing was clear. Whatever was out there didn't like the noise. I could feel the shift in the air the same way you sense a storm rolling in. For the first time in my life out here, I allowed myself to step back. Just one step. But it felt like a confession. The silhouette moved again, closer to the edge of the light. My brain raced to explain it. A bear standing, a trick of perspective, a hallucination brought on by adrenaline. But every explanation fell apart under the weight of what my senses were telling me. This thing was watching me, studying me, waiting for something. And then it clicked. A sound I'd heard referenced in stories but always assumed was metaphor. A knock. One single, heavy, resonant knock against wood. Not a branch falling, not a woodpecker. A deliberate knock, as if answering a question I hadn't asked. My heart pounded so hard my vision blurred at the edges. The knock echoed a second time, this one farther back, like another creature responding. Over the years, I'd logged countless encounters, strange sounds, missing hikers, unexplained footprints that vanished mid-stride. But that first knock, it set the tone for everything that would follow. It taught me something fundamental. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. And the things that lived in its darker pockets, they weren't just animals, they were part of something older. Something that had been here long before rangers, long before loggers, long before the maps we cling to with false confidence. Standing there on that ridge, staring into a darkness that felt like it was staring back, I realized something I never admitted out loud until much later. I wasn't the protector of this place. I was a guest, a fragile one. And that night was only the beginning. In the days that followed, I tried convincing myself that the encounter had been nothing more than exhaustion magnified by forest acoustics. Every ranger who's worked enough cold nights knows the way your senses can stretch sound into shapes that don't belong to it. But the knock wouldn't leave me. It replayed in my mind with impossible clarity, not just because it was loud, but because it had rhythm, intent, almost etiquette, as if it weren't meant to scare me, but to announce something, or someone. 3 days after that night, I visited the small diner near the county line, a place where loggers, hunters, and rangers often crossed paths. The kind of place where truth traveled faster than coffee refills, but only if told in the right tone. I wasn't planning to talk about what I saw, but the forest has its own way of pushing things to the surface. A local trapper, a man named Birch who'd lived out here his whole life, took one look at me and said, "You heard it, didn't you?" I froze. My coat was still zipped, hands still in my pockets, but he saw something in my eyes that gave me away. "Heard what?" I asked. Birch didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just nodded at the door as if the forest itself was listening from the other side. "The knock," he whispered, "always starts with one." I felt something ice cold slip down my spine. All my training told me not to indulge superstition, but I'd already stepped past the line where logic kept its footing. "What does it mean?" I asked. Birch scratched his beard and said one word before turning back to his plate. "Attention." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to, because that word followed me back into the pines like a thin shadow. It wasn't until the next incident that I realized attention wasn't something I wanted from whatever lived deeper than our maps could carve. The next encounter wasn't mine. It came from a couple backpacking near the northern drainage. I was sent in after dispatch received fragments of a panicked call, heavy breathing, cries for help, then sudden silence. They never finished the call. And when I arrived, the trail looked undisturbed, brushed clean by the wind. But something was off. The forest felt too still. Sound didn't travel properly. It seemed to drop straight into the ground. Even the birds stayed quiet. I found their campsite half a mile off trail, tucked near a slope of boulders. A fire pit lay cold, tent flaps flung open by the wind. Inside were their packs, their jackets, their food supply, all untouched. But not their boots. Their boots were missing. Most hikers don't leave their boots behind, not in terrain like this. 2 sets of socks sat neatly beside the sleeping bags, almost as if placed there intentionally. That neatness, that order never sits right in the wilderness. Nature doesn't arrange things. Humans do. I stepped outside the tent and crouched low to inspect the soil. No tracks, no drag marks, no signs of struggle. But then the wind shifted, carrying something faint but unmistakable. A smell. That same metallic coldness I'd sensed on the ridge. But this time it was sharper, like it had been waiting beneath the surface and was now rising into the air because I'd disturbed the scene. I backed up and nearly tripped over something behind me. When I turned, my breath hitched. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth between two trees, was a single footprint. Not human, not bear, not anything I'd ever seen outside the plaster molds in cryptozoology exhibits. It was wide, deep, and long, longer than my forearm. And it wasn't old. Moist soil still clung to the edges. Whatever made that track had passed through less than an hour before. My heartbeat picked up as I slowly scanned the trees around me. The silence pressed tighter. The air suddenly felt too heavy to breathe, as if the forest were holding its own breath. I took a few steps, but with each one I felt more exposed, like something was watching me move. Not with animal curiosity, with awareness. There was a fallen log 10 yards ahead, covered in damp moss. As I approached it, a sharp sound broke the silence. A knock. Not distant like before. Close. Heavy. Almost at eye level. I spun around, hand instinctively dropping to the pepper spray on my belt, though I knew, without question, that it would do nothing against whatever made that footprint. The knock came again, this time behind me. A different tree, a deeper tone, a reply. My breath fogged the air in shaky bursts. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I tried rationalizing the knocks as branches snapping from the cold, but instinct crushed the idea. It wasn't wood breaking. It was something hitting wood, knuckles, fist, hand, something. I took a step backward, only for a third knock to echo through the clearing. This one softer, higher, like a child answering. No one was there, at least no one I could see. I lifted the radio and forced my voice steady. Possible missing persons. Camping gear found. No sign of them. Need backup to grid the area. Static hissed back, then nothing. The forest swallowed the signal. Somewhere above me, something exhaled. I couldn't see it or hear it clearly, but I felt it move the air. A slow, deliberate release of breath that slid down the back of my neck. I took another step, and another. Not running, but retreating. Moving like a prey animal pretending not to be prey. Every instinct screamed at me to break into a sprint, but old rangers taught me long ago, if you run from something you don't understand, you teach it the shape of fear, and fear is the easiest trail to follow. When I reached the main trail, the pressure eased, the birds returned, the wind loosened. Sound traveled normally again, but I knew what the forest wanted me to understand. Something, or multiple somethings, had taken the couple, and they hadn't tried to hide it. They'd left no prints except the one I found, not as evidence, but as a message, a footprint where footprints shouldn't exist, a knock pattern too coordinated to be coincidence, a cold metallic scent marking the air like a territorial boundary. I reported what I could back at headquarters. Left out the knock, left out the footprint, the missing hikers were declared lost. A full search was launched, no bodies were ever found. But back in the diner a week later, Birch sat across from me and said, "They marked you." I didn't ask how he knew. The way he looked at my face, stoic and tired, told me he'd seen it before in others. "Marked me for what?" I whispered. The old man leaned forward, his voice gravel soft. "For watching." Those words sank into me like cold water. Because I realized then something crucial. The forest wasn't testing my skills. It was testing my attention, seeing if I could perceive what most refused to see. And whether I wanted it or not, I passed. From then on, the strange events didn't just find me. I felt them waiting for me. The escalating stories that followed weren't just warnings. They were lessons, invitations, threats, riddles carved into the forest's nightscape. But there was one encounter, the next one, that shifted everything. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I heard. A sound so human it broke something inside me. It began with a call for help. A voice. A real one. A voice that shouldn't have been there. A voice that knew my name. A voice that knew my name. Even now, decades later, I can still recall the exact tone of it. A strained whisper, trembling with desperation, threaded with something that felt like dread. It was the kind of voice you don't ignore, even if every part of you wishes you could. It happened on a fog-heavy evening near the limestone caverns east of the boundary line. Most people don't know about the caverns. They sit between old growth that hasn't been touched in a century. The ground there always feels colder, like the earth is storing memories it doesn't want disturbed. I was hiking the ridge above them when my radio let out a high-pitched burst of static. At first, I thought it was interference from the rock formations below, but beneath the static, buried under layers of distortion, was the faint outline of a voice. My name, spoken once, soft, drawn out like a plea. I froze so abruptly that gravel slid down the slope beneath my boots. I raised the radio to my ear, waiting. A long stretch of silence followed. Too long, too deliberate. Then the voice came back, clearer this time. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't panicked. It was tired, like someone calling for help with their last bit of strength. But something was off. The second time it spoke my name, it didn't carry the breathy timbre of a dying hiker. It carried the cadence of someone who had practiced it, someone who knew how to shape my name with their mouth, someone who shouldn't have. "Copy," I whispered into the mic, forcing my voice not to betray the unease flooding through me. "If you can hear me, identify your location. Are you injured?" Static. Then the same whisper again, but this time, the tone bent. The syllables stretched and warped as though someone was struggling to imitate human speech. My name twisted on its way out of the speaker, distorting like fabric tearing. I lowered the radio slowly. The forest around me thickened. Fog drifted between the trunks in long, pale strands, sinking into low pockets of earth. The air smelled different, damp stone, cold mineral, and something faintly organic, like old fur wet from the rain. I shouldn't have gone down toward the cavern mouth. But the voice had laid a hook in me, and part of me, some stubborn, misguided fragment of instinct, needed to know whether someone was alive down there. Every step down the slope felt heavier, as if the ground resisted my descent. When I reached the narrow ledge that overlooked the cavern entrance, the fog grew dense enough to brush my face like cotton. The cavern yawned below, a black wound cut into the mountain. Air pulsed from inside it in uneven breaths, cold enough to sting my nostrils. I've entered caves before, rescue training, wildlife checks, the usual protocols. But this one, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. I clicked my flashlight on and stepped toward the entrance. The beam didn't travel far. It seemed to bend, swallowed by the dark before it could map the contours of the stone. I felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees. My breath clouded instantly. Then I heard it again. Not from the radio this time. From the cave. My name. Soft, raspy, barely formed, but unmistakable. "Talk to me," I called out, voice echoing in the hollow behind me. "If you're injured, I'm coming in. Stay where you are." The forest swallowed my words. I stepped inside. The stone beneath my boots was slick with moisture, and the air tasted old. Older than the trees, older than the soil, older than anything with a pulse. The sound of dripping water echoed from deeper within, but beneath it, something else. A slow scrape, something dragging across stone. The beam of my flashlight skimmed across jagged walls. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. I told myself it was just the beam shifting, but my chest tightened anyway. I advanced 10 feet. 20, 30. The scrape stopped. The cavern exhaled around me, a long, cold draft that felt almost like fingers brushing my cheek. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Then the voice came again. Closer, clearer, perfectly mimicking a human tone. Except it was wrong. Every human voice has micro-breaks, tiny pauses between breaths and syllables. This voice didn't. It didn't breathe. It didn't wobble. It didn't carry fear. It carried imitation, as if something had learned what a human voice should sound like but had never actually used one. And then it said something else, something worse than my name. "Help me." The words staggered out, unbalanced, a forced mimicry of distress. I should have backed out, should have turned. Should have trusted the instinct screaming through my bones. Instead, I stepped deeper. The flashlight caught movement. A figure stood at the far end of a narrow tunnel, a silhouette barely visible in the beam. Tall, too tall, shoulders sloped, limbs hanging long and uneven. But it held still, like it had been standing there for an hour, maybe longer. A trick of shadows, I had tried telling myself, but then it leaned. Not a shift of weight, not a step, a lean. Like something bending at the spine without moving its legs, a slow, unnatural tilt, and then it spoke again, not with the radio's distortion, not with the soft mimicry from the cave entrance, but with perfect clarity. My name, not whispered, not strained, but spoken like someone greeting an old friend. My blood turned to ice. I stepped back, boots sliding on wet stone. The silhouette straightened, my flashlight flickered, sputtering against the cold. Then, a knock. Inside the cave, a deep, resonant knock against stone, so close it vibrated the walls. My flashlight died. Everything went black. I froze. Total darkness pressed against my face. I couldn't hear my own breathing over the drum of my heartbeat. I forced myself to count silently. 1, 2, 3. A sound broke the darkness. Footsteps. Slow. Wet. Deliberate. Coming toward me. I fumbled for my radio, hands shaking. Static erupted the moment I pressed the button. Then, through the static, another voice broke through. Not the mimic, a human voice. A ranger from base. Hey, your GPS just dropped. You good? Over. I didn't hesitate. I'm coming out, I whispered. Stay on the line. I turned blindly, sliding one hand along the cold cavern wall. Behind me, the footsteps quickened. My breath caught as the cave narrowed. My shoulders brushed stone. I couldn't see, couldn't think, only move. The footsteps came faster, then stopped, then resumed. But now, from ahead of me. My mind fractured. Something impossible was blocking the exit. I felt the walls closing. No, that was just me trying to squeeze through a space too tight for panic. I pushed forward with everything I had. The first hint of daylight appeared in a thin gray veil ahead. Fog. Cold freedom. I lunged toward it. Something brushed my shoulder. Cold. Hard. As if a hand with too many knuckles had grazed my jacket. I burst out of the cave mouth gasping, stumbling into the light like I'd surfaced from drowning. I turned back, ready to confront whatever followed. Nothing emerged. The fog swirled. The cave yawned. Silent. Still. Watching. I fell against a tree, chest heaving. My radio crackled with my partner's voice, grounded and familiar, a tether to the world that made sense. But even as I tried to speak, something caught my eye. Just inside the darkness of the cave, a pale shape, tall, motionless. And then a knock. Gentle this time, barely audible, like a reminder. A reminder that I had gone somewhere I shouldn't, heard something I wasn't supposed to, and escaped only because something else allowed it. I turned away and forced myself back up the ridge, but even from a distance I could feel the cave behind me, not as a place, as a presence, a threshold, a promise. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake in my cabin, lights on, listening to the forest press against the windows. Because the worst part wasn't the mimicry. It wasn't the silhouette. It wasn't the impossible footsteps in the dark. It was this, the voice that called my name inside the cave. It wasn't alone. Behind it, layered softly beneath the mimic, was a second voice. One I recognized. One from a missing person case that never had a body. One from a hiker who'd vanished months earlier. A voice no one should have been able to imitate. A voice no living person could have heard again. And yet I did. Deep underground, in a cavern that felt like the earth remembering its dead. Deep underground, in a cavern that felt like the earth remembering its dead. For days after that encounter, I moved through my duties like a stranger in my own body. I patrolled the trails, checked camp permits, greeted hikers at the station, but everything felt thinner, like I was walking through a version of the forest that wasn't entirely real. The trees were the same. The wind carried the same resin-rich scent, yet something beneath all of it had shifted. I had crossed some invisible threshold, and the forest knew it. More importantly, something in the forest knew me. I kept hearing faint echoes of that cave, the scrape against stone, the unnatural voice mimicking pain, the second voice layered beneath it like a trapped breath. I would close my eyes at night and see that silhouette, tall, pale, still, the way it leaned without moving its legs, the way it stopped when the cave went dark, as if darkness were its natural state. And always, just before I drifted into sleep, a knock would echo somewhere in the back of my mind. At first, I thought it was just my nerves replaying sounds I tried to push away. But then the knocks started happening outside, on the cabin porch, on the trees near the ranger station, once on the metal door of the fire lookout tower while I was halfway up the ladder. I'd shine my flashlight into the trees, expecting a bear, a prankster, a lost camper. Each time the beam caught nothing but stillness. No footprints, no movement, no wind, just silence. Patient, deliberate silence. Locals noticed the change before my fellow rangers did. People in town stopped asking casual questions and instead offered sideways glances that lingered too long. One old woman at the general store brushed her fingers over the counter and murmured, "You hear them clearer now, don't you?" without ever looking up. When I asked her what she meant, she only said, "You shouldn't have followed the voice. They know your shape now." She wouldn't explain. A lot of people out here won't. They believe explanations give things power. Maybe they're right. But explanations or not, the forest didn't wait long before teaching me its next lesson. It happened on a fogless night. That detail stands out the most. Clear skies, bright stars, a stiff wind that kept the branches rattling, A night that should have felt normal, grounding even. But as I drove the perimeter road toward the southern trailhead, that uncomfortable pressure returned in my chest. Not fear, recognition, the same sensation you get when stepping into a place where you've once been hurt. The radio stayed silent. My headlights cut through the narrow winding road skirting the ravine. The pines leaned overhead like a serrated tunnel. I saw the turnoff ahead, but something in me tensed before I reached it. Someone was standing on the road. A figure, small, hunched, still. A person, by shape alone. Arms hanging limp by their sides, legs angled slightly inward. I braked hard, tires grinding gravel, the truck shuddered. The figure didn't react. For several seconds, I just stared, breath tight in my throat. My high beams washed over them, yet the shadows clinging to their body didn't fall the way shadows should. They held on, thick, resisting the light. I cracked the window an inch. "Hey," I called, forcing steady authority into my voice. "You okay? Are you hurt?" No response, not even a shift of posture. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The first thing I noticed was the temperature drop. A cold pocket of air existed only around the figure, like stepping into the center of a forgotten winter. My breath turned white. Frost glimmered on the gravel beneath their feet, though the rest of the road was bone dry. I raised the light, and the stranger lifted their head. Not all the way, just enough for me to see. Skin too pale, eyes too wide. Pupils reflective like a nocturnal animal's. Their mouth hung open slightly, jaw slack like someone who had forgotten how to use it. But the worst part, the part that hit me with a bolt of nausea, was the face itself. I recognized it. It was the missing hiker, the one whose voice I'd heard inside the cavern, except the eyes didn't match the face. The movements didn't belong to a living body. Even the stillness felt wrong. Too controlled, too intentional. I stepped closer, voice caught somewhere between command and disbelief. "If you can hear me, I'm here to help. Do you understand?" The figure tilted its head slowly to one side. Then, in a voice that scraped something buried deep in me, it said, "Help me." The same phrase from the cave, spoken in the same wrong cadence, the same imitation of desperation, but delivered while staring straight into my eyes. I stepped back involuntarily. My flashlight shook in my hand. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't a person, not anymore. Something was using their shape, wearing it like clothing. The mouth opened wider, too wide. The lower jaw unhinged just slightly, like the tendons weren't bound by human anatomy. Then, knock. A single sharp knock echoed from the tree line. The figure jerked toward the sound, head snapping unnaturally fast, its spine elongated with a sickening stretch. A second knock, deeper, further into the forest. The figure turned its entire body, joints moving like poorly fitted hinges. It took one step toward the trees. Then, a third knock. Higher pitched, a reply. The figure began to walk, not toward me, not down the road, toward the forest, into the darkness between the trunks. I don't remember choosing to follow. I only remember motion. My legs carried me after it, though every cell in my body demanded I stop. I couldn't let this thing disappear with a body we'd spent months searching for. Couldn't let it vanish into the silence with that borrowed face and mismatched voice. I followed 20 yards, 30, 40. The trees closed around us like gates. I raised my flashlight, and the figure was gone. Just gone. No branches disturbed, no footprints, no displacement of the air, only the cold remained, hanging thick around me. Then, far deeper in the woods, came a new sound. Breathing. Not fast, not panicked. Slow, measured, wet. I felt my body shut down, muscles tightened, my hands went numb. The breathing grew louder, though nothing moved. It circled me without footsteps, above, below, around, impossible directions that didn't match any physical shape. Then the breathing stopped, and a whisper grazed the back of my neck. Not my name. Something else. A phrase spoken so faintly I thought it might have been imagined. Back to the cave. I spun, heart hammering, flashlight trembling wildly. But the forest behind me held nothing but empty air. The wind shifted. The breathing returned. Left side. Right side. Behind me. Then, knock. But this time, the knock didn't sound like it came from a tree. It came from the earth, a deep, hollow knock from somewhere far below, like bones striking cavern stone. And then the forest fell silent. The cold receded, the pressure lifted, the breathing faded. I stumbled backward until I reached the road again, gasping like I'd sprinted a mile. My legs shook so badly I had to brace against the truck door. The figure never returned, neither did the body. But the message was clear. carved into the hollow space where my certainty used to be. Whatever lived in that cavern, it wasn't confined to it. It wandered. It watched. It mimicked. And now it wanted me to return. That night, after reporting what I could and omitting what no one would believe, I sat in my cabin with the lights off. The moon cast a pale glow through the window, painting the pines in skeletal silver, and as I stared into the dark, unable to breathe, unable to think, the same thought circled in my mind. The forest wasn't hunting me. It was summoning me. The forest wasn't hunting me. It was summoning me. I tried to ignore that truth for as long as I could, burying myself in routine, radio checks, paperwork, trail inspections, maintenance runs, anything that felt ordinary, anything that grounded me in a world where trees were just trees and caves were just caves. But the ordinary dissolved one night without warning, torn away like a curtain pulled off a window. It started with a dream. I was standing in the mouth of the cavern again, the cold air spilling out in long, rhythmic breaths. The stone walls pulsed faintly, as though something far beneath them was moving, slow, ancient, stretching after a long sleep. In the dream, I stepped inside against my will, feet dragging across slick stone. Then a whisper crawled through the darkness. Not a voice, not an imitation. A whisper made of stone grinding against stone. It said one word. Return. I woke drenched in sweat, chest aching, breath sharp and uneven. The cabin was silent except for the slow ticking of the wall heater. For a moment I told myself that was all it was, a nightmare stitched from fear. But when I swung my legs off the bed, my blood iced. There were footprints on the cabin floor. Not human, not animal. Large, bare, pressed into the thin layer of grit that blew in through the door seams. And they were wet, as if something had walked through water or deeper before stepping inside. I followed the prints with trembling hands, flashlight cutting across the floor. They led not toward the door, but toward the wall facing the forest. The footprints grew fainter, as if evaporating, until the final one disappeared beneath the window frame. I raised my eyes. Outside at the tree line, a silhouette stood between two pines. Tall, still, watching. I held my breath. The silhouette didn't move, not for 5 seconds, 10, 20. It simply existed, unnervingly patient, like the forest itself had grown a body just to observe me. Then, slowly, very slowly, it lifted one arm and pointed. Not at me, not at the cabin, at the ridge above the caverns. I blinked once, and the silhouette melted into the darkness. The decision wasn't logical. It wasn't brave. It wasn't even conscious. I dressed, laced my boots, grabbed my radio and flashlight, and stepped out into the night with the same strange calm a person feels while walking into their own memory. The forest felt different. The air was thicker. The pines leaned closer, their boughs whispering without wind. Every sound was magnified, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the soft rustle of small animals fleeing my path, even the faint hum of my breath echoing against my own ribs. When I reached the trailhead, the moon was high, silvering the landscape with an eerie brightness. I could see the ridge clearly, the jagged silhouette of stone and timber rising like a spine above the tree line. That was when I heard it. A knock. One single knock, carried from high above, followed by another, then a third, farther apart this time, more distant, like the forest was calling me up the mountain the way a parent calls a child home. I reached the base of the ridge and began climbing. The path was narrow, winding between boulders and fallen logs. The temperature dropped with each step. Soon, my breath fogged, my fingertips numbed, a familiar metallic scent hit the back of my throat. It was the same cold smell from the campsite, the same metallic tang from the cavern, the scent that told me I was approaching the threshold of something not meant for human understanding. Halfway up the ridge, I heard the first voice, the missing hiker's voice, calling my name, sounding exhausted. Pained, desperate, but it was wrong again. The cadence was too steady, the vowels too elongated, the fear too rehearsed, like an actor reciting a tragedy they had never lived. I stopped, gripping a pine trunk for balance. "Where are you?" I shouted. The voice responded instantly, in the dark. The words slithered through the trees. I kept climbing. The ridge narrowed to a ledge overlooking the cavern system below. Moonlight washed the stone in pale blue. The mouth of the cave pulsed faintly in the dark, exhaling cold air that drifted up the slope. The knocks echoed again, this time from below me. Then, in a moment that froze my breath mid-chest, the forest went silent. Completely. Totally. Unnaturally. No wind, no insects, no shifting branches, just stillness, deep and suffocating. And then from the cavern mouth a sound rose upward. Footsteps, not echoing, not bouncing off soft, wet, climbing. Something was walking up the inside of the cave wall, scraping the stone as it rose, moving in a direction no living thing should be able to move. I backed away until my boots hit the ledge behind me. Gravel slid down the slope. My heart pounded so violently I felt it in my teeth. Then the breathing started. Slow, measured, and very close. I swung my flashlight toward the cavern. The beam shook violently in my hand. Something stood just inside the entrance. A shape, tall, pale, eyes reflecting the moonlight like shards of frozen water. And beside it, slightly behind, another shape. Smaller, human-sized, slouched, swaying. The missing hiker. Skin gray, eyes blank, mouth open, a puppet held upright by a string of shadows. My throat constricted. "Let him go," I whispered, though my voice barely carried beyond my own shaking breath. The taller shape leaned, not forward, not toward the hiker, toward me. And then it spoke, but not with human vocal cords, not with mimic desperation. It spoke with the weight of stone and earth and centuries. Its voice vibrated the ridge beneath my boots. Return. The hiker's jaw snapped shut. The silhouette straightened. Everything inside me screamed to run. But something deeper, a place inside my mind I didn't know existed, locked me in place. I felt the world blur around the edges, my vision darkening like the forest was closing its hand around me. The tall figure lifted its arm and pointed, not at the cave, not at me, at the ground beneath my feet. I didn't understand at first. Then the ledge cracked, stones splintered, soil crumbled. The ridge began to collapse under me. I lunged backward, grabbing at roots and rock, scrambling up the slope as the earth gave way in a violent roar. The cavern mouth yawned wider as stone fell away. A rush of freezing air blasted upward. For a moment, I swear, I saw a hand reach from the darkness. Long fingers. Too many joints, grasping for me. I scrambled higher, crawling, clawing at the earth until my nails tore. The ridge shook. The cavern groaned. The forest bent with a shuddering breath. Then, knock. A single, loud, thunderous knock from deep within the caverns. Everything stopped. The collapse halted. The wind ceased. The trees stilled. The forest seemed to exhale, and the presence retreated. Not defeated, only waiting. I lay on the slope, gasping, staring into the pulsing darkness below. The hiker was gone. The tall silhouette gone, the cold scent already fading. Only the ridge bore the scar of what happened, a gaping wound torn into the stone. I made it back to the cabin just before dawn, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe normally for hours. But as the sun rose through the pines painting the forest gold, a truth settled into me with quiet finality. The forest chose me to witness what it hides. Not because I'm brave. Not because I'm worthy, but because I listened. I saw what most people spend their whole lives pretending doesn't exist, and now I carry it. Every knock on a distant tree, every echo inside an empty ravine, every cave that exhales cold air like it remembers the dead. They aren't just warnings, they're reminders that the forest is older than us, stranger than us, and far from empty. Some nights, when the wind dies and the world holds still, I sit on the cabin porch and listen. And sometimes from deep within the pines, a single knock answers, a reminder that the spirits of the forest are still out there, still watching, still whispering. And one day, when the time is right, I know I'll have to return. End. The first time I heard the forest breathe, I told myself it was just the wind, because admitting anything else would have meant walking away from the one place that ever felt like home. My name isn't important, not anymore. Names feel small out here in the Sierra Pines, where the trees stand older than the first footprints my people ever pressed into this soil. I'm 41 years old. A forest ranger by title, but some days it feels more honest to say I'm just a man trying to stay sane in a place that doesn't like to be understood. I've spent more than half my life patrolling these woods, long enough to know the forest has two faces, the one it shows the tourists and the one it shows the people who stay past dark. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, it's always shown me the latter. Locals in the closest town, 100 pine-shadowed residents surviving off summer campers and old logging money, call this stretch of wilderness Whisper Ridge. Not officially. On maps, it's just the northern portion of the Sierra National Forest, but anyone born within 50 miles knows the stories. Old men at the diner lower their voices around the subject. Old women cross themselves. The young don't talk about it at all. But they all know what happens out there when the sun goes down. Still, for most of my career, I chalked the strange stories up to mountain superstition. Wind slipping through rock crevices, ice expanding and cracking, animals sounding like something they aren't. I was a man of sense, trained to treat every unknown as a combination of variables waiting to be solved. But reason has a way of peeling off your bones when the forest wants you to see deeper. I arrived at Whisper Ridge as a rookie ranger, assigned to a cabin built in the 1970s and left mostly untouched since. The wood stove still smoked no matter how often I cleaned it. The radio crackled with static unless the wind was blowing exactly north, and the walls creaked. Every night, sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., in a rhythm too slow to be settling wood and too steady to be coincidence. That was the first sound that ever unnerved me here. A low, hollow knock, like someone flattening their palm against the siding and waiting for permission to come in. Every morning, the knock stopped. Every morning, I convinced myself it was just temperature changes. And every morning, the locals watched me with this quiet pity, as if they already knew I'd chosen a place that intended to unmake me piece by piece. The first real story I collected, one I didn't dare write down in any official report, happened during my 3rd month on the job. It was late spring, that time when snow still hides between the rocks, but the days warm up enough to make the forest smell alive again. I'd hiked out alone on a routine trail inspection, following one of the older fire roads that wound toward a ridgeline thick with old-growth pines. The air felt heavy, like the sky was waiting to drop a storm, though we had no weather warnings. And for the first time in a long while, the forest was completely silent. When a forest goes quiet, something is wrong. Every ranger knows that. I slowed my pace. The stillness wasn't peaceful. It pressed against me, dense as water, muting the sound of my boots, my breath, even the branch I snapped underfoot. The silence swallowed everything before it reached the air. I tightened my grip on the radio on my vest, though I already knew it wouldn't do a damn thing out here. Whisper Ridge kills frequencies the way fire kills dry grass. I walked for another hour before I found the tracks. They were human-shaped, but not human-sized. Each print was nearly twice the length of mine, sunk deep into the soft earth as though whatever made them weighed far more than a person should. But what unnerved me most wasn't the size. It was the spread. The prints were spaced almost impossibly far apart, long strides like something covering ground at a speed far beyond human limits. I crouched beside one, pressing my palm over the indentation. It dwarfed my hand, clawed edges framed the heel. And the depth. God, the depth looked like whoever made it had carried the weight of a fallen tree. My first instinct was to rationalize. Melted snow, distorted prints, shadows tricking my eyes. But shadows don't leave claw marks. I straightened and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound. Even the breeze had died. My pulse hammered louder than anything around me. I followed the prints, or maybe the prints led me. I still don't know which, until the fire road split into a narrow off-trail path little more than a game trail used by deer. The tracks continued along it, weaving between pines so thick their trunks felt like pillars holding up the sky. I heard something then. Not a sound, exactly. More like a sensation, a distant vibration that crawled into my jaw and behind my teeth. A low, resonant hum like the forest was inhaling. My breath caught. I waited, listened. Then, faintly, came the knock. Not behind me. Not from my cabin this time. Ahead, somewhere deep in the trees, 3 slow knocks, then silence. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around. Get out. Pretend I never saw those tracks. But part of me, the part that made me a ranger in the first place, refused to leave anything unexplained. So I forced my legs forward one step after another until I reached a small clearing shaped almost perfectly like a circle. The tracks ended here. Just stopped. No return trail, no disturbance, no broken branches, and no body. God help me, I almost wish there'd been one, anything to make the scene make sense. Instead, in the dead center of the clearing, sat a single pine cone. Not unusual for a forest, except this one was upright, balanced perfectly on its narrowest end, defying gravity like some kind of offering or warning. I crouched slowly, scanning for movement. Still nothing. No birds, no insects, no wind. Then the smell hit me, metallic, sharp, a scent like rust and wet stone, as if the forest floor had been cut open and something old was bleeding beneath the moss. I stumbled back, covering my nose. The clearing spun for a moment. My vision blurred. I couldn't place the source of the scent, but it filled my lungs, thick and hot, creating pressure in my skull like my own heartbeat was fighting to escape. And just as quickly as it came, it vanished. I blinked hard, looked around. The pine cone had fallen over, just tipped onto its side like it had never stood at all. I got out of that clearing fast, almost running until the trees thinned and the normal forest sounds trickled back in. Birdsong, insects, the scratch of something small moving through underbrush. It felt like surfacing from underwater, like I'd been somewhere the natural rules didn't apply. I didn't file a report, didn't mention the prints, didn't say a word about the scent or the standing pine cone. I told myself I needed more evidence, as if the lack of evidence wasn't the most terrifying part. But that night, lying in my cabin bed staring at the ceiling beams that creaked like shifting bones, I waited for the familiar knocks on the wall. 1, 2, 3. They didn't come. Instead, something else happened. A voice, low, almost human, whispered my name from outside the door. Not shouted, not growled, whispered, soft as pine needles brushing together. And in that moment, every rational thought I'd clung to in those woods shattered like brittle bark, because I realized it wasn't the forest that wanted to be understood. It was something inside it, something that had just learned mine. I didn't move when I heard my name whispered outside the cabin door. Not at first. Fear has a way of freezing the body long before it reaches the mind, like the nerves revolt before the thoughts can catch up. I stared at the doorframe, expecting another whisper, a deeper one, maybe even a knock. But the cabin fell still again, the way a dying fire goes quiet right before the last ember snaps. The silence lasted a full minute, maybe longer. Time didn't behave normally that night. It stretched thin, trembling around me like a spider's web. My heart hammered in my ribs until the pulse drowned out every other sound. I swallowed hard, my throat dry enough to hurt, and finally forced myself to sit up in bed. My flashlight was on the nightstand. My hand shook as I reached for it. I didn't shine the light at the door. I didn't want to. Part of me convinced itself that if I didn't illuminate the space, maybe I wouldn't have to see what stood on the other side. But the deeper truth was that I already knew the doorway was empty. The whisper hadn't come from eye level. It hadn't come from the height of a person standing. It came from lower, too low, like something crouching. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for anything, a footstep, a breath, a trigger of the motion sensor outside. Nothing came again. And when morning finally returned, color to the world, I stepped outside to search for prints in the mud. There were none. Not a single disturbance, no indentation, no drag marks, nothing. But the air still held that faint metallic scent, a trace of the clearing clinging to the doorway as if carried on something's fur. That was the morning I stopped pretending the forest and I played by the same rules. Over the next few weeks, small things started changing in ways that didn't feel small at all. I'd return from patrol and find the cabin door cracked open even though I'd latched it. My boots would be shifted an inch to the left, or my canteen turned sideways, or my logbook closed when I knew I'd left it open to dry. All subtle, all easy to blame on my own exhaustion, until they became too precise to ignore. One evening, I came back late from a check-in near the ridge and found a pine cone sitting upright in the center of my cabin table. Exactly like the one in the clearing, balanced on its narrowest end. I stared at it long enough for the sun to fully disappear behind the pines. I didn't touch it, didn't breathe near it, didn't even want to acknowledge it. But the longer I watched it, the more the room felt like it was tilting, not physically, but perceptually, as though the forest was peering in through the windows, waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't report that, either. Instead, I started visiting the nearby town more often, staying later at the little diner that smelled like coffee and cracked vinyl seats. Locals would eye me from behind their mugs. Some nodded, some didn't. None asked questions. But one old man, white beard, eyes sharp enough to cut bark, sat next to me one night and said, without looking up, "You've started hearing them, haven't you?" I froze. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just stared down at his plate like the eggs were more interesting than the terror he'd just named aloud. I asked him what he meant, even though my voice came out thin. He stabbed a bite of egg, chewed, swallowed. Then he said something I've never forgotten. Not even years later, when I tried to convince myself these stories were shaped by fatigue or fear. They never talk to a man unless he's close to the line. I asked him, what line? He tapped the side of his head with a crooked finger, the one between what's real and what belongs to them. I wanted to laugh, or tell him to mind his own business, or walk away. But instead, I just sat there, unable to move, because deep down I knew he recognized something in me, some shift in the eyes, maybe, or tension in the jaw, or a quietness in the way I listened. He didn't say anything else, just finished his meal, left a tip, and walked out into the dusk. When I looked through the diner window a moment later, he was already gone. That was the same week the second story began. It started with a scent, not a sound. A cold night in early summer, temperature dropping faster than the forecast predicted. I was hiking down from one of the observation towers after monitoring a controlled burn area. The burn had gone well, steady winds, low flare-ups, good containment lines. But the walk back felt wrong. Not dangerous, not at first, just wrong. The forest smelled different. Not smoke, not pine, not earth. It smelled like wet fur. Thick, damp, almost sweet in a rotten way, like an animal that had been caught out in a storm for too long and never dried. The scent rode the wind and curled around me, heavy enough that I could almost taste it. I knew the scent of every large animal out here. Bears, deer, mountain lions, even the packs of coyotes that occasionally wandered through in winter. Nothing smelled like this. Nothing should have. The further I walked, the stronger it got. I wiped my nose with the back of my hand, thinking maybe something had spilled in my pack, but the smell wasn't on me. It was in front of me, drifting between the trees like a trail. And then I heard the breathing. It wasn't loud. If anything, it was too quiet. A slow, wet inhale. A longer exhale. Coming from my right, deep in the brush. I stopped walking, hand resting on the grip of my radio, even though I already knew it wouldn't pick anything up. Whisper Ridge didn't carry signals at night. It barely carried sanity. My breath fogged the air. The temperature had dropped again, enough for frost to begin forming along the edges of fallen leaves. I scanned the tree line, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing moved. Another breath. But this time, it wasn't in the brush. It was behind me. I spun, raising the flashlight, and the beam struck something tall. Taller than me. Taller than any person I'd seen this deep in the forest at night. A shape, a silhouette. Shoulders hunched, head lowered, like something deciding whether it should stand upright or stay partially crouched. The beam hit its eyes last. They reflected the light like a deer's, but wrong, too close together, too low, too full of thought. Eyes shouldn't look deliberate. They shouldn't look like they're reading you. But these did. The creature didn't move. I didn't breathe. Its chest rose once, slow. Then it released another breath. Long, fogged, heavy, mist rolling out in front of it as though the forest itself exhaled through its lungs. My hand went numb around the flashlight. I couldn't run. Every instinct I owned told me movement would trigger something I couldn't take back. So I did the only thing my training had drilled into me. I stood my ground, but I didn't stand tall. I lowered myself, not into a crouch, not into submission, but into something small, like I was letting the creature decide if I belonged here or not. The smell of wet fur thickened. The shape shifted. A step, one step, slow enough to freeze my blood. The ground trembled under its weight. Then, from deep in its chest, a low rumble rose. Not a growl, not a threat, but something closer to a question. And for the first time in my career, I truly doubted whether the forest saw me as part of it, or prey standing in the wrong place. Or prey standing in the wrong place. That doubt crept through me like cold water soaking into cloth, heavy and numbing. Every instinct warred against the stillness I forced myself to hold. The creature towered in front of me, half shadow, half flesh, its silhouette blurring where the darkness thickened between tree trunks. My breath came in small, controlled draws, the way we trained for mountain rescues, not to panic, not to startle the injured or the unpredictable. But nothing in any training manual had prepared me for this. The creature inhaled. The sound was wet, dragging, almost curious. I felt it in my ears and jaw more than I heard it, and when it leaned slightly to the left, as if trying to see me from another angle, I had the unmistakable sense that it was studying me with a patience no predator should have. When it finally shifted its weight, a soft snapping crack beneath its foot echoed across the clearing. A twig. A simple twig, and the sound cut through the silence like a trigger. My body flinched, barely. Just enough. The creature's head twitched, a single sharp movement, too fast for anything that size to make. A sound rose out of it then, something between a breath and a vocalization, not a growl, not a howl, just a rumbling exhale that seemed to press against my ribs from the outside. And then it stepped back. One heavy step, another, and with a slow, deliberate turn of its shoulders, it melted into the trees. The darkness swallowed it faster than any natural shadow should. The wet fur smell faded, replaced by the cold, wild, ordinary scent of pine. I stood frozen long after it disappeared. Not until my flashlight began flickering, a sign the battery was nearly dead, did I move again. I forced myself to walk the remaining half-mile to the cabin, refusing to run, refusing to give the forest the satisfaction. But when I reached the porch and my knees finally gave out, trembling against the wooden steps, I realized my teeth were chattering. The temperature had dropped almost 20 degrees since sunset. Inside, with the door locked and the stove lit, I sat on the floor, my back against the bed, and stared at the wall until dawn. My radio sat beside me, the static shifting softly like a heartbeat. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink much. Because the creature hadn't chased me. It had studied me. And that was worse. The next day, the ranger station called. They wanted me to check the northern drainage path for downed branches after last week's storm. I said yes out of habit, but the idea of returning to the forest so soon made my stomach twist. I wasn't afraid of the woods, not in the way most people would think. I was afraid of what the woods had decided I needed to see. Still, I strapped on my pack and went out. Ranger duty doesn't bow to fear. The first mile was normal. Birds chattered, squirrels darted. The temperature rose. If someone had followed me without knowing what happened the night before, they'd think the forest was nothing but beautiful shadows and soft light. But halfway up the ridge, I smelled it again. The faint trace of wet fur, not fresh, lingering, like something had moved through not long ago. My heartbeat quickened. I forced myself to keep walking, scanning the trail for scat, prints, fur, anything normal that would make the scent rational. Nothing. Then, on a bend in the trail where the pines arched overhead like a cathedral, I found the first sign. Handprints. On a fallen log. Huge handprints, far larger than mine, pressed deep into the bark as if something had braced itself there. The prints were elongated, the fingers too long, too thick, ending in small divots where claws or nails or something harder had dug in. But that wasn't what froze me. What froze me was the number of them. 4. Not spaced like normal hand placements, not a sequence of motion, aligned, side by side, perfectly straight, like something had placed them intentionally, like a message. My throat tightened. I crouched slowly, running my fingers along the ridges in the bark. The impressions were fresh, splintered wood, fine dust, loose edges. Whatever made them did so last night, maybe hours ago. The air thickened, heavy and still. Behind me, a single pine needle drifted down and tapped the leaves. That soft tap felt like a warning. I straightened, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the forest felt too quiet again. That wrong kind of silence. The air pressing, the pines leaning inward. I forced myself to step back onto the trail. I had to keep going. The drainage check was routine, but the rangers who didn't show up to duties were the ones who got pulled off Whisper Ridge, and I couldn't let that happen. Not yet. Not when the forest had started revealing pieces of itself that no ranger before me had dared describe out loud. I followed the trail another half-mile until it narrowed into a steep descent. Dry pine needles slipped beneath my boots. The air grew colder again, enough that frost clung to patches of moss despite the rising sun. At the bottom of the slope, I found the creek that fed the drainage system. Thin, shallow, nothing remarkable. Until I saw movement upstream. Something crouched beside the water. It was large, hunched, its back to me. I froze mid-step, holding my breath. The creature's shoulders rose and fell in slow, controlled motions. It wasn't drinking, it wasn't washing. It was still, too still, like a statue carved from muscle and shadow. My fingers twitched toward my radio, useless as it was. I stayed absolutely quiet, the creek gurgling softly between us. My breath felt like it was scraping my throat. Minutes passed. The creature lifted its head slightly. I saw its profile, not fully, but enough to understand it was unlike any animal classified in North America. Broad jaw, forward pointing face, a slope to the skull that didn't match bears or apes or anything in between. Its ears turned toward me, slowly. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Another minute crawled by. Then it did something that chilled every drop of blood inside me. It tilted its head back and exhaled. Not a howl, not a grunt, a sigh. Soft, human-like, a sound of exhaustion or grief. The forest swallowed the sigh as if protecting it, as if the sound didn't belong to this world. The creature lowered its head again, shoulders sinking, and something inside me shifted, a thought I didn't want, a realization I couldn't run from. This thing wasn't hunting. It was hiding from something worse. My hand trembled around my radio. I didn't call for help, didn't dare. The creature hadn't noticed me yet, or maybe it had and simply didn't care. But before I could decide whether to retreat or watch longer, the creature stiffened. Its entire body tensed. Its head shot upward, eyes fixed on the trees behind it. Not on me. Behind it. Something moved there. Something I didn't see. Something the creature feared. Its chest expanded, breath held. The forest held its breath too. Then the creature stood, slowly, silently, rising to its full, impossible height, and looked back over its shoulder into the shadows, its expression tightening into something unmistakable. Terror. Not of me, not of any human, of the forest itself. And when the first knock echoed through the trees, deep, hollow, rhythmic, coming from somewhere beyond the creek, somewhere impossibly far and impossibly close at the same time, the creature's eyes widened, because the knocks weren't calling me. They were calling it. They were calling it. The creature's reaction was instantaneous. Its massive frame recoiled, not backward, not toward me, but inward, compressing with a tension that looked agonizing, like every instinct in its body battled the pull of those deep, resonant knocks. My breath snagged in my chest. I had thought this thing was the apex of the forest, the nightmare that generations whispered about. But whatever was knocking, that was the thing it feared. Another knock boomed through the trees, louder now, almost metallic, echoing down the creek bed until the water vibrated in rippling circles. The creature's muscles trembled. Its eyes turned glassy. For the first time, it looked small, still impossibly tall, but diminished, shrinking beneath some invisible weight pressing down on it. It turned toward the shadows behind it, the direction of the sound. Then it looked at me. Not in surprise and not in curiosity like before. In warning. Its eyes, dark amber, reflecting the cold dawn light, locked onto mine with a clarity that didn't belong to animals. Something old lived behind them, something that had survived winters and fires and storms long before any ranger ever set foot here. And in that moment, I understood the message as clearly as if it had spoken out loud. Run. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing in the loose rocks near the creek. My breath came fast, shallow, cold air cutting into my lungs, but something rooted me there. Something between terror and disbelief. The creature took one heavy step away from the water, its body into a defensive stance. It faced the forest, not me. Its chest expanded, breath rumbling like distant thunder. It was bracing itself, preparing. The third knock hit hard enough to shake the branches overhead. Pine needles rained down in a thin shower. The ground quivered beneath my boots. That broke whatever spell had held me frozen. I turned and climbed the hillside with adrenaline fueling every desperate step. The incline was steep, covered in frost-slick needles that made my boots slide, but I clawed my way upward. Branches slapped my face, sap stuck to my sleeves. My breath billowed in front of me like steam escaping a cracked pipe. Behind me, the creature released a sound so deep it didn't echo. It resonated, shaking the air itself. A low, guttural roar that wasn't a challenge, wasn't aggression. It was fear, and something else answered it. A sound I can barely describe. Not a roar, not a howl, not anything human or animal. It rose from the ground itself like wind passing through a hollow mountain. A vibration more than a voice, a tone that curved and folded and layered upon itself until the forest felt alive with it. The creature's response cut off abruptly. I forced myself not to look back. Whatever was happening behind me didn't want to witness. I crested the ridge and half slid down the other side, branches tearing at my arms. My boots skidded on loose dirt. Once, twice, 3 times I nearly fell, catching myself in frantic bursts that left my wrists throbbing. The forest changed again. Air thinning, light dimming, sounds muting until all I could hear was my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. But I didn't stop. Not when the cold deepened. Not when the trees leaned inward. Not when the air seemed to whisper in low, ancient rhythms I felt more than heard. I didn't stop until my cabin finally came into view through the thinning trees, its silhouette rising like a dark shape in the brightening dawn. I reached the porch and collapsed to my knees, gripping the railing until splinters dug under my nails. My breath tore in and out, raw and ragged. My chest felt bruised from the inside. I listened. Nothing followed. The forest behind me held its breath. For the first time since I started working at Whisper Ridge, I went inside and locked every latch, every bolt, even the one at the top of the door most rangers never bothered with. Then I sat in the middle of the cabin floor, shaking, waiting for the knocks to begin. They didn't. The forest stayed silent. The creature didn't return. But I didn't sleep. Not that night, nor the one after. When exhaustion finally dragged me under, it was only for minutes at a time, shallow dozes filled with sounds that didn't belong to this world. For 2 days, I stayed close to the cabin. I filed my reports, kept my radio charged, and checked the window every few minutes as if expecting a face to appear there. But the forest offered nothing. No clues. No answers. Just the same heavy quiet that had settled over everything. On the third night, I heard the whisper again. Not my name this time. Just a single word. Come. It drifted through the crack under the door, soft as a fingertip tracing the back of my neck. My breath hitched. I stared at the door, heart pounding. I didn't open it. I didn't move. But something inside me, some fragile piece that still believed reason could protect me, started to crack. For weeks afterward, the forest felt wrong. Not hostile, but watchful. The locals in town grew quieter when I walked in. They exchanged looks behind my back. One elderly woman stuffed a pine sprig into my jacket pocket without saying a word. A man sharpening a hunting knife outside the hardware store paused as I passed and muttered, "You're still here," as if genuinely surprised. I tried to reach the ranger superintendent for a transfer. Every paperwork request was denied or lost or delayed. Whisper Ridge does that. It holds on. But the forest didn't escalate again. Instead, it waited. Nights passed without knocks. Days passed without tracks. The creature didn't show itself, not even at a distance. I almost convinced myself it had moved on. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't gone. It was hiding. And whatever had knocked, whatever had called to it, was still out there. The last story, the one I never told anyone, not even the superintendent, came months later, on a warm September evening when the forest glowed gold in the fading light. I'd hiked to a rocky overlook where the pines stretched endlessly below. It was a place I went to feel grounded, safe, human. The wind shifted and the smell of wet fur drifted up from the valley. Faint, almost sad. A moment later, I heard something moving far below, a shape walking between the trees. Tall, slow, alone. I recognized its silhouette instantly. The creature looked up, not at me, at the overlook itself, as if sensing something watching from above. We were too far apart for detail, too distant for danger. But even from that height, I recognized the tension in its posture. It wasn't stalking, it was searching. The creature lifted its head slightly higher, and for a second, a single breath length, it locked onto me across the distance. Then it raised its massive hand, not in threat, not in warning, in acknowledgement, like two living things sharing a secret neither asked for. A gust of wind rushed through the overlook, carrying pine needles across the rocks. When I looked back down, the creature was gone, vanished between the trees without a sound. And that was the moment I finally understood the truth. Whisper Ridge had been whispering all along. The forest doesn't choose its monsters. It shelters them, protects them, and sometimes it shapes them out of the people who stay too long. I didn't leave Whisper Ridge after that. Maybe I should have. Maybe I still should. But the forest has its own gravity, its own pull, and something in me, some stubborn, fractured instinct, knows I'm meant to be here a little while longer, not as a protector, and not as prey, but as someone walking the thin line the old man warned me about, the line between what is real and what belongs to them. So now, when hikers ask me why they shouldn't wander off trail, when campers swear they heard knocking outside their tents at night, when locals whisper their stories in the diner and fall silent when I walk in, I don't tell them they're imagining things. I don't tell them it's the wind. I don't tell them the forest is harmless. I tell them the truth the pines taught me. Some things out here breathe deeper than we do. Some things walk older paths. Some things knock only when they want to be heard. And the forest remembers every whisper it's ever carried, even the ones spoken in your own voice.